We are live. Let me just double check on the actual page. Just 1 second. Yes, we are live. Take it away, Liam.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Raphael. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the fifth installment of the Double Bill Lecture Series. This is part of the New Center's public program. My name is Liam Sibai. I'm a researcher at the New Center, and I also help organize these lectures. So just very quickly to give you an idea of what I'm going to be doing, I'm just going to introduce myself a little bit more, read a short introductory text, and then I'll introduce our speakers and their topics, and then we can just get started. And after that, we'll do questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them after the two lectures. So, like I was saying, I'm a researcher at the New Center. I'm largely interested in aesthetics and heritage. I published 2 articles with triple ampersand, the New Center's publication platform on aesthetics, where I published 2 articles on aesthetics. And when it comes to heritage, I gave a lecture within this lecture series about heritage. And part of what I'm interested in within the domain of heritage is the Neolithic period or the agricultural revolution. And why I'm interested in this period is because more or less I think this is when heritage started. You can think of, for example, how in this period humans largely stopped being nomadic. So rather than going around sort of taking the resources of a place or consuming it, they started to farm, to do agriculture, therefore doing something more we can call sustainable. That's a popular word right now, but I think in this case it applies to a large extent. And why I'm interested in this end of nomadism and this introduction of the sedentary life or of settlement is because, again, this is largely when religion started to come about, when sort of quasi-nations or countries in different cities and so forth. But also, interestingly, if I know my history correctly, please tell me if I'm wrong, everybody. But this is largely when architecture started, and this sort of makes sense, I think, because when humans sort of became settled, you need sort of uh, structures and structures that can stay there. You can leave and come back, but the structure, the architectural structure, will still be there. So yeah, so why this is, I think, interesting or relevant to our theme tonight, which is anthro-texture, is because I think, and again, you guys can correct me or give me sort of your views, but I think this is largely when the figure of the human as we know it comes about today, of course. The modern human is very different from the pre-modern human and so forth, surely. But I think to a large extent, the human starts with architecture, I think. So anyway, I'm going to start introducing our speakers. Denise Luna Acevedo is an architect, researcher, and professor from Tijuana, Mexico. She studied architecture at Universidad Iberoamérica, Tijuana. She's a researcher in the program The New Normal, the 2018 iteration at the Strelka Institute, where she collaborated in research and design projects for cities, exploring the impact of emerging technologies on new types of interdisciplinary design practice. She is the recipient of the full scholarship certificate for the Post-Planetary Universal Design Program at the New Center for Research and Practice. She's a partner at, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry, Studio Santander and Luna. She's the co-director of the TIOC think tank and a co-founder of SALAA and a founder and director of Pragma. Denise's lecture is about how architecture is an important part of world making, be it towards the possibilities of worlds or to ensure a continuation of the same world. And therefore, I think for her, architecture is seldom neutral. The severity of the ecological crisis at the tipping point of collapse calls for immediate action. So often efforts are directed to intervene rapidly and directly into, in quotes, fixing the problem. This sort of tunnel vision strategy could prove problematic, since the crisis is not only ecological, in quotes, but also structural and systematic. The same world is a product of current practices, modes of operation, and technology guided by ontological and epistemological totalities on a constant positive feedback. Contingencies that are the making of solely human or same human logic or logics enters the feedback loop and accelerates the system's recursiveness. These are used to reinvent themselves into an endless optimized present instead of providing ground for discovery and reinvention. Okay. Khares Tokatlidis has a main architecture degree from the Technical University of Crete. They are mainly interested in research on emerging social structures as responses to new technologies, aesthetics of thought, considering mental health, and critical discourse beyond dualities. They are the project manager of Nature Loves Courage, of the Nature Loves Courage Festival, a global lineup, intimate scale, Flinta electronic music festival in Crete. They curated and realized Ultrasonic Infracries, a group exhibition that explored relations between manic depression symptoms and latent cultural tactics in contemporary capitalism. This was their thesis, and it took place at the ESTO Association in Athens. They are a student at the Arts and Curatorial Program at the New Center for Research and Practice. And Khares will approach the theme of anthropotecture by looking into the question of public space in the current stage of network cultures. How does content and capital circulation affect emancipatory politics in the apparatus of the intertwined fabric of the physical and digital space? Can social media link public spaces by syncing consensus? And is there actually a public space in Mykonos? So we're going to start with Denise's lecture. So Denise, please take it away.
Thank you, Liam, for introducing us. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to the new center. Thank you, Liam, for the invitation. And also, thank you for the understanding, Liam, Khares, Raphael, and the new center for postponing this talk. So I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So like Liam sort of mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that we have recently worked with in our Studio Santander and Luna, and also some ideas that we also created with Pragma, and I'm going to talk about that later. I'm going to share my screen. So maybe you guys can let me know if you can see it.
Perfect.
All right, perfect. All right, so architecture. Architecture for us, it's a world-making pragma. Here we understand pragma as what Negarestani mentions in his seminar, Humanism and Discontents, as something that unfolds in a system of practices. Pragmas, he says, are concrete determinations, acts of concrete determinations. Architecture unfolds into something concrete most of the time. And yet, at this, it also is theoretical. As architects, we constantly oscillate, or in our practice, we oscillate constantly between world-making theory and practice. It's this sort of constant oscillation. And additionally, architecture could operate towards possibilities of worlds, like Liam mentioned already, or it could ensure the continuum of what we call in our work the same world. Yes, the severity of ecological crisis is not our efforts to intervene as architects are usually focused on fixing the problem when it has already happened. And like Liam, and I'm sort of repeating what Liam said, this tunnel vision strategy could be problematic because the same world is a product of current practices, most of operation and technology guided by ontological and epistemological totalities. And even if, or most of contingencies or even the C-no, or things that are different, sort of are sucked in this feedback loop and accelerates the recursiveness of the systems. So yeah, we need to revise our system and our logics of capitalism, globalism, sameness, and what we call the human with capital H. And to reappropriate technology, we need stealthy and abstract activism. We need to deploy abstract activism, which I will touch on a bit later. So we can have no resolution to planetary emergencies nor technological misalignments and algorithmic failures at any level if we do not also design the notion of the human in each deployment. This is why thinking about practices, how do we practice, what are practices, is crucial. It is what will determine what will be and what the planet will be. To quote Reza again, he mentions that we need to seek our practices vertically, horizontally, and transversely, from top to bottom, from bottom to up, and from one side to another. We can design and construct new practices to deploy those abstract forms of activism that are needed. And architecture has already done it in the past. Architecture had a significant breaking point during the Renaissance period. Before this breaking point, architecture was descriptive. In the 1st century, with Vitruvius' ideas from the books De Arquitectura, architecture looked backward. Vitruvius attempted to preserve and explain architectural principles based on the past. In the 15th century, Battista Alberti, in his work De Reedificadora, turns things around. Rather than copying past practices, Alberti's work moved architecture toward a more prescriptive framework. He laid out principles for constructing futures with the idea that architecture is an intellectual pursuit grounded in rational rules. Architecture turned from explaining how to read the past to prescribing how buildings will be constructed in the future. Joseph Rickwert, in his translation of Alberti's Reedificadora, says, and I quote, "Vitruvius tells you how the buildings that you may admire as you read him were built, while Alberti is prescribing how the buildings of the future are to be built." And of course, there are many other thinkers of that time, like Andrea Palladio. But the point is, this opened the door for a new system of practices, which many architects followed. For instance, the Tempietto from architect Bramante marked a significant rupture in the history of architecture. It marked the construction of an architectural vision that looks forward, which we still practice today. This is a historical example of how an alternative pragma followed someone's rational and abstract thoughts, ideas, and principles, in this case, Alberti's. And before I share some of the practices that we are working on, I want to go to Tempietto, go back to the Tempietto as an example of a rupture in the history of architecture. In parallel with the rupture and construction of a new world, the imaginary of the globe, built through colonialism and specifically the invasion of the Americas. According to Fernando Luis Lara and his work and amazing research, colonialism and architecture as a discipline as we know it today, and that prescriptive framework that I mentioned before are connected. Colonialism and architecture as a discipline are connected. The Tempieto was a commission from the Spanish crown, Isabel de Castilla, to celebrate the conquest of Iberia and the Indies. Although it marked the beginning of a new pragma, the Tempieto, kingdoms prosperous by their conquest had a fundamental role in the construction of this architectural building. The discipline of architecture as a projection towards the future comes from the global imaginary colonization. And not because of the impact on form and design of the Tempieto, not because of how it looks like, how do we see it, but because of the actions, flows, and resources that led to its construction. Now, we as architects, in our traditional academic training, or at least here in Latin America, we're not trained to think about those flows before a building may manifest. Even less to think about the imaginaries of like the globe and the planetary. And as we saw in the example of the Tempieto, it is not only relevant, but fundamental for architects to engage design at the scale of the imaginary systems that are able to change our geography. And here I quote philosopher Lucas Likashkhan in his book, Introduction to Comparative Planetology, where he clearly, in a very clear way, he describes how different imaginations or images of the planet lead to geopolitical arrangements, and how different those geopolitical arrangements lead to various biochemical and physical arrangements of our planet. And when reading his book, when reading the figure of the globe in his book, which the globe seen as a smooth sphere, I interpret that as a smoothness that allows for the occupation of the Americas. Even though we all know it was in fact not a smooth space or a clean space, nevertheless, Lucas reminds us of the power that the planetary imaginary can have, and how we need to also think about other planetary imaginaries, which he also proposes in his book. Brilliant philosopher. And architect Lara agrees with this. He describes in his research when he rethinks history of architecture in the Americas, how the Americas were seen as something that was, quote, fully masterable terraqueous globe. So where and when then is architecture? We know buildings are part of the physical arrangements, and therefore it's part of the planetary. It contributes to it, it's part of that scale. We know also buildings count for around 35% of total carbon emissions, for instance, as one example. We all know, and this is important. It's important to always think about how to design and construct buildings. It's relevant, definitely. However, we argue that at the same time, not instead, at the same time, we need to engage and navigate other questions. The questions of the human, like Liam mentioned that we were going to talk about later, the question of the human, the question of pragma, and the question of our planet. Now, how do we engage into the abstract of our contemporary reality today? And I want to share with you some of the practices that we are constructing and revising. So I want to share this with you. It was a fun exercise to how to delineate, discover, or even invent practices. And the first practice is asymmetrical crisis and the crisis of asymmetry. The traditional understanding of asymmetries between Latin America and the global north needs to be revised. The notion that Latin America is simply a passive recipient of global forces is inaccurate. The region has a long history of agency and has shaped these asymmetries into novel designs. Today's most pressing challenges are climate change and the normalization of hegemonic technologies and their homogenizing logic, such as the market-driven AI that perpetuates and expands a same world logic. These technologies are not monolithic. When implemented in Latin America, they undergo process of tropicalization. However, these processes are usually cosmetic, enabling the operations of same world logics in a specific context to perform with familiar form while maintaining the West's content. Now, there are gaps in the new opportunities for designing technologies more responsive to local needs and priorities. And we call this the crisis of asymmetry because it is not a single monolithic condition of negativity. The concept of asymmetry is revised and utilized. It is a complex and dynamic process unfolding across Latin America in different ways, times, and scale. It makes asymmetry a practice. This crisis is also an opportunity for new designs. By navigating within an asymmetrical crisis and remaining in it, in the wound, as Luciana Parisi would put it, we can forage for cosmotechnics, new ways of thinking about and using technology, not only for constructing an unimaginable Latin America, but also for sharing our techniques for a healed planet. Now, the second practice I want to share with is the construct placements. In the Mino dialogue, the philosopher Socrates emphasizes the need for rigor when attempting to define something. As an example, he uses the definition of form. He says that someone cannot define something just by naming its characteristics and features of something. Like a round shape is a type of shape, but it's not a definition. And he goes on. And from our interpretation, Socrates made a leap from the dimension of space to the dimension of time. How come? In one of his responses, he exclaims, and I quote, "Form is that which always follows color." So we interpret that as he did a placement in time. We define placement in time here. Another thing that we thought when this idea of construct placement as a practice, for instance, comedy or a joke depends on specific times and context. A joke has a rhythm that enables the appropriate timing or trigger and triggers the cognitive switch in our heads that generates laughter. So construct placements inspired by the comedy and jokes and the Socratic provocation. We argue that beyond the type of project category, or project features, what I mean by this is what it does, how it does it, with whom it does it, how it looks, where it's located, although there are essential points. Yet the timing of the project's context will determine its success when creating new worlds, at least in Latin America. And understanding what comes before and what comes after certain projects or certain practices can make the difference. You can have the best joke in the world or even the best project with the best ideas, but in the wrong context at the wrong time, it gets lost, or worse, it sort of continues, like we said, in this funnel system that already exists, which is what we don't want. We want to alternate new worlds. We want to move forward. So therefore, it's necessary to think and design time-wise as well. And this is what we call placement as a practice. Tactical unlearning. According to Hegel's notion of reflection, non-being leads to being. And as he points out, a negative aspect can be fundamental to develop a proposition. However, the negative aspect must always consider its results and advances in its positive aspect, and vice versa. The negative is one phase of the reflection. In this way, we understand the potential of world unmaking as a strategy that leads for world making or world building. And this is something we also worked on here at the New Center at a seminar with many of my classmates, including Carl, Orson, and Mustafa. And it was so long ago. So from conceiving the unmaking of something, we can design the construction of something. This engagement opens the way to new engagements, says J.P. Karen. Tactical unlearning is about dissociating context, techniques, technologies, our history, humanity. It's about unlearning all of those things. But it's not about erasing everything for the sake of erasing everything or abolishing for the sake of abolishing. It's about unlearning tactically and opportunely to be able to build other worlds, to be able to answer the questions of what is human, what is pragma, what is architecture, what it is that we need to do. In these worlds that we build, we need to dissociate them from the contemporary tendencies, disciplinary canon, and knowledge with a capital K. And the final practice that I want to share with you today is planetary architecture. Now, we know that the planet is not just a fixed frame of reference in which human bodies and other entities inhabit. There's a planetary scale that manifests in localities. But architecture doesn't seem to grasp this. It's a little bit behind here. Architecture ceases to, it needs to be, it needs to cease to be a manifestation of culture styles and topologies, and needs to, will turn to resemble computational architecture for the planet, for planetary architecture as a practice. It becomes planetary human infrastructure. By understanding planetary architecture as a practice rather than a discipline, profession, or praxis, it would be more efficient in dealing with and managing emergencies that occur on each fall of time and context. It is to have it is about agency and agility in the face of the conditions that are coming or that we have today. From planetary architecture as a practice, Latin America is a context to discover other forms of commitments and ways of doing things. And Latin America becomes not only a site, but a new frame of reference for design. Lastly, I want to share with all of you about planetary frontlines. A couple of years ago, I assembled a team of leaders from our region in Baja California, Mexico. Alex Santander, Alex Ruiz, Catalina Silva, and other collaborators. We created a platform called Pragma. Pragma is a design platform for multidisciplinary practices that enables the transformation of the planetary through Latin American context. We were honored and grateful to be invited last year to be creative directors, Pragma to be creative director at the 18th Venice Biennale in the CDX Venice Virtual Pavilion Knowledge Transfer. Now, the main idea we wanted to explore as in this exhibition, this virtual exhibition, is that Latin America is ground zero for planetary emergencies. The urgency to confront, design, and intervene in a world of asymmetrical crisis has exalted existing practices to engage in the front lines of change. To design for better worlds in a healed planet, we think begins and ends in Latin America. Why? Because around more than 60% of biodiversity of the planet comes from Latin America. So we invited 15 multidisciplinary projects from diverse backgrounds, disciplines, and these projects range from urbanism, design, architecture, art, activism, philosophy, and theory. And the exhibited projects aim to showcase transformative practices for Latin America, from Latin America or Latin Americans working on something. The exhibitions were mainly from works or thoughts from Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. And apart from this, we organized a series of conversations with the exhibitors. One of the conversations was called Other Worlds, and in this conversation, we learned how to approach otherness. We learned that we need to learn how to approach otherness still. And mainly the challenges of collaborating in a world of diversity of languages, cultures, and worlds. In the conversation Planetary Thinking, we explore projects of architecture and technodiversity and speculation, mainly how our practice is connected to a planetary scale, like I mentioned, and how we need to address that, how we need to address many scales at the same time in our projects and in our thinking. And in the conversation Navigating Latin America, the third conversation, we joined government and nonprofit institutions where they shared their agile methods and strategies for transforming our world, for transforming our territories. And it was useful. It was useful because, again, we oscillate between practice and theory constantly as architects and other disciplines. And the final conversation was called Where and When is Latin America? This conversation was about how Latin America unfolds towards the planet and how the planet unfolds towards Latin America. And we asked questions like, what are the implications when we question where and when Latin America begins and ends? Where exactly does it end? And the participants, the conversations were amazing. Some of them were students here, like Zenobio Almeida and Igor Anario with their studio Placer Expediri, for instance, with amazing projects. And finally, we created this video that you're seeing here in collaboration with Mario Alvarado and Ian Glauco, also from here from Mexico, from Tijuana, Mexico. And this piece that I've been sharing, this last video, is not a representation of something. It is a system and a model. It is a process of adhesion, an asymmetrical practice in the crisis of asymmetry between distinct entities to enable collaboration in a preset same world while permitting each to flourish on its own. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Denise. I have a question I'm excited to ask you, but we'll do that later. Okay, Khares, if you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Denise, and thank you, Liam, and the New Center for the invitation and for this opportunity. It is my first lecture in English, and I thank you all for being here. So what I would like to discuss about and the way that I approach the question of anthropotecture, meaning the combination of anthropology practices and methodologies and architecture. I am going into the relationship between the public space and social media and network culture. Network culture in the 21st century, as it appears, has created, and I think it is also a disruptive moment in how we approach architecture and the history of architecture for many reasons. but mostly because the experience of network culture has revealed many connections and many ways to inhabit other than or without the tool of the dueling. So we are talking about body politics. We are taking and participating in maybe Discord communities or internet communities. We engage through these communities. We are, as tourists, create cultural heritage actively and engage in other communities in parts of the world that we are not living in. We spend so much time in front of our screens and UIs. So it is really a question of inhabiting without the dueling. And this is very important for the architecture dialogue today for me, because this needs to be acknowledged. And the architecture discipline is also connected to architecture studies, which are not only about architecture discipline and about designing space. They are actually a multidisciplinary approach in studying in most universities of the world. So I think that when it comes to the question of the political importance of architecture today and of space, we need to think about all the disciplinary qualities of synthesis that the architecture students have learned during the studies, even though they may not design buildings after that. What I did was that I actively participated. I used the method of active participation and qualitative observation in the context of Mykonos during the summer to work on this theme. Mykonos is a very well-known island in global scale. It offers exquisite, luxurious amenities and services to mostly rich people, not just white people, but it has a culture that is very well connected to social media. Social media have this effect of creating consensus between different communities about some things. For example, there was an attack in Greece this spring in Thessaloniki, and because the attack against LGBT people from nationalist groups was streamed, the next day, the entire ally community of Thessaloniki gathered and marched together. This became an issue of public dialogue. So social media can link and bridge and actually mediate between physical public spaces and what happens in these public spaces and what is coming to be discussed, and creates a network of resistance. At the same time, though, the internet doesn't actually have public space. When I talk about public space here, I'm talking about it through, I look at it through the viewpoint of radical democracy. In the discourse of Sandal Mouffe and other researchers, public space is a battleground, I quote, which is about different hegemonic projects, and this is confronted as a reality without the possibility of final reconciliation. So it's inherently agonistic. Democracy and public space is about novelty and the political and what emerges from resistance. And we cannot really talk about public space if we cannot about a dialogue that has the right to bring novelties and to reveal novelties. This happens in Mykonos. You cannot reveal novelties in public space. I argue that there is not public space in Mykonos for many reasons. First of all, the absence of the political subject. In Mykonos, bodies are commodities. I quote from conversations I had myself with people who work in Mykonos in many different fields, mostly illegal, or to be more precise, not legally acknowledged. That in 40 days, so many people come here to either live and spend tons of money or take tons of money, and they can do it in many, many different ways. The bodies are commodified. People think about your network and your net worth all the time. For example, Mykonos is not a very before I go into the example, Mykonos is not a very, it's a small world. It's not so multi-layered. It's very close to what we call the collapse of a society. And when I'm talking about the collapse of a society, I mean the sense that a society is rapidly it loses rapidly its capacity to have many, many different like professions. For example, in Mykonos, there are 1, 2, 3, 5 things tops that you can do if you work there, unless you're a property owner. You can either be an escort, you can either be a drug dealer, you can either be a waiter, and all these people, or you can either be a transfer person, which I'm gonna go into in a while. And all these people create a network of an activity that is very close to what Hakim Bey calls a temporary autonomous zone. The temporary autonomous zone has some characteristics. Between them, and I quote, Hakim Bey talks about pirate utopias, about information networks, about booty traded for luxuries, about intentional communities outside the law. They talk about psychotopography as a way, or as the only way to really grasp the reality of a place when the map is not able to do that. And they are saying that the net has a hierarchical aspect, that also another characteristic is the absence of the nuclear family as a structure, or as a structure that supports the entire structure of the community. And it has characteristics of festival and festivities, which are very apparent in Mykonos. And it talks about the psychic nomadism in the epoch of commodity fetishism. Mykonos has all of these characteristics. For example, apart from it's like a huge rock garden and the rocky landscape there, which is infamous of the Cycladic landscape and architecture, it creates a scenery that is, everything seems to be observable, like you cannot hide if you're out in the landscape, but at the same time, everything is hidden. What you will realize as soon as you get there is the culture of the transfer. The roads of Mykonos are filled with black luxury vans that transfer either humans or products, or humans acting as products or commodities, and also drugs. Like I haven't met a single transfer person in Mykonos that couldn't link me or directly, if I wanted to, supply me with illicit drugs. It's an entire culture of getting away from the boundaries and the limits of excuse me, of rational speech and of logos, and it goes against the law. And the important aspect that connects this with architecture, or what there are some similarities, but also differences between how you can approach this cultural manifestation now and what architecture cannot do about it. For example, the walls of Mykonos are not the Venetian era walls you can find in other islands in Greece or in the Mediterranean. They are exactly the mafia networks that operate there that are capable of ensuring the circulation of the capital and of the products in the area. Mykonos, for example, does not acknowledge building laws in a national level, and this is an issue in Greece that has been talked about widely in the news. Last year, the head of authority that was supposed to investigate issues of illegal building in Mykonos was attacked by mafia. And these networks actually manifest themselves either immaterially or materially within the rest of the space. The boundaries are not spatial, don't have spatial attributes anymore, but they have network attributes. And even the transfer people who are the link between everything on the island, that is actually a huge open air mall and nothing more than that, but a mall that you can actually buy anything, enjoy luxury, being high. All the people that work there, or most of them, are being operate this whole thing while being high for like 2 or 3 months when the summer season is actually active. And it's an amazing place. Like, even if you're not high there in Mykonos, you can just roam the entire Hora or the entire town, and because of its medieval urban architecture, but also these picturesque architectural devices and dwellings that has in space. It's like a maze. You can go from one bar to the other, meet everyone, talk to everyone, and you feel like, oh wow, this is like, people are so social here. But then you realize that all these people there are trying to achieve something. They are trying to create more capital for themselves, even in terms of money or in terms of broadening their network. And social media is a very, very critical in this equation, because, for example, if you're a celebrity and you want to go through the town of Mykonos and you just make some appointments or some calls and be like, hey, I can just come by your shop, or I can post a story in your shop without tagging or anyone, you can live with tens of thousands of dollars after a 3-hour walk in the town of Mykonos if you're a celebrity. And you can see even not just Hollywood or cinema celebrities, but also social media celebrities and influencers. And for example, Sibai artists just posting in Mykonos and being like, I'm here. And through other networks such as OnlyFans and other deep web platforms, people know if you're there or not. And this is very important because I had this conversation with someone who is working there, aspiring to be a new age Tony Montana, which is actually a thing there. Many people aspire to be that. And he was like, if you can bring people, that's all we need. We don't care about anything else. As long as you can bring people here and you can bring more people here, this is what we want. You are welcome. You're seen as a capital commodity link at the same time and nothing more. I figured like very early in the days that I was there that all social transactions eventually become, all social interactions eventually become transactional. That's a reality. You really feel that you are in a Hobbesian environment where there is no law other than how much can I make through my activity in these days here, or how much I can actually consume. It feels like a race. It is very racist, even though Mykonos is celebrated for being inclusive or the queer community. This queer community there has to be gendered. Like you couldn't really see non-binary people, and it has to be like recognizable through aesthetics that are welcome and are pushed by the platforms of social media. So the algorithm of social media and what kind of content it pushes forward has a lot to do with how you can actually be in Mykonos, what your appearance can be like. You have to signify that you can consume and that you can be consumable. And what was very interesting was that even though I was not active on social media during the days that I was in Mykonos, I got so many followers that had nothing to do with the people I interacted with there. Like it was like I couldn't find another explanation for it other than the fact that the platforms could see my location, and just because I was able to be in this location, I was pushed forward in the algorithms and got more followers and got more space. So this creates an alarm for me of how you can actually resist and fight about your rights as a political subject who wants access to public space in the terms of radical democracy, when the algorithms don't give you the space and they interact with physical space in a real-time manner. I could be talking about experiences in Mykonos like a lot. I have so many notes of things I could refer to, but I would rather be asked more questions about it. Give me a second. Oh, another very important part is that the culture of Mykonos is a very, very well-designed framework. For example, all the hotels have their own resident escorts. You don't know that. It's not something that is out in the open. It is not something that is like through, or it's not something that is actually public knowledge, but it is knowledge when you're on the island. When you meet people there, they ask you, how many years have you been coming to Mykonos? Which hotel are you staying in? People talk and know about anyone that operates actively and actually tries to create an income through their activity on Mykonos during these days. Hotels have their own residents who bring clients from OnlyFans or other platforms. It's about bringing more people and about making more money for the entire structure and nothing else. There is no dialogue about social issues. You just have to have fun, and you feel it when you're in this space, that you cannot disrupt this equilibrium. It feels like if someone harassed you, the best way to deal with it was not to create an issue, just move on and disengage. You should never disrupt the fun there. everything's supposed to be fine and everything's supposed to be working. Thank you for your time. I can talk more about it, but I think that I've made my points clear about the connections between the public space, the network culture, and the case study of Mykonos, and what kind of communities can be created or autonomous zones can be created through these in this era, actually, of these technologies.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much, Khares. I want to ask you a bit of a selfish question because I'm a big fan of TAZ, Temporary Autonomous Zone. So I maybe wanted to ask you an almost personal question, but Lea, like, can you tell me a bit more about your relationship with this text, what you find insightful or not so insightful about it? Maybe you don't like it very much, but it's quite useful within what you wanted to talk about. So yeah, I was curious about this.
Oh, yeah. I was familiar with the ideas of the text like for years, but I haven't really read the whole thing until now because of Mykonos. It was I tried to find, of course, I had an idea, but I tried to find the tools and the theoretical frameworks to support what I wanted to say about the island after my investigations there and after my time there. I think that it really helped me and it gave me very important tools. Nevertheless, I have to say that this text feels like it does not recognize some things about class issues or community issues. It's a very interesting text, but I think that it does not. It cannot draw ways in which to deal with this. For example, yes, I can see many aspects of Mykonoan culture in this text, but how to deal with this, the text doesn't give any answers.
Okay, I see. Thank you. And please remember, everyone, if you want to ask a question, please leave it in the chat and I'll forward it. Denise, I wanted to ask you something, or rather, I wanted to request from you to elaborate more on colonialism and where you see it fit in the history of architecture, perhaps how it changed it, but also in the history of the human. Because like for me, when I was introducing everything we were going to talk about, I talked very briefly about or maybe not so briefly, about the agricultural revolution. And for me, the agricultural revolution is in a way very similar to the advent of colonialism, and I'm specifically talking about the European colonization of the Americas, because I think both historical events essentially, you know, there was an excess of the means of sustenance, shall we say, and the human population grew, to a large extent with these two events. So I'm personally very interested in how these two events sort of speak to each other. But yes, maybe I'm asking you more, on the architecture side. What do you think is the importance of the event of colonialism, I suppose?
Sure, Liam. Thank you. Thank you for your question. We can talk maybe an hour about this. Yeah, I when thinking about this event in particular, it was first of all because I'm Latin American, and reading Fernando Luis Lara really opened our eyes in our practice, because when we're studying architecture, we usually have a preconception history of architecture. We have our own universal history of architecture, and usually when he actually has a map when you can see all the buildings that we need to study and the styles, and there usually are in Europe, or maybe the northeast of USA, with Sullivan. And I'm not gonna go into detail of that. But Fernando Luis Lara's work really opened our eyes in looking inside, but not just the influence that Europe has had in the Americas, but how the Americas actually have contributed to the history of architecture also in Europe. And this is why I think his work is fundamental for us architects to implement in our studies. And one of the things he even questions, I mean, it's not a fact, it's just a speculation, but I don't think it's coincidence. I agree with him in that sense that yeah, the Tempieto and many other late Renaissance architecture buildings were commissioned by Spain using resources from the Americas. So architecture, in a way, always, not always, in this case, follows the system or the imaginary of the Americas as this free space, which we know is not free space. And what's interesting is the philosopher Lucas mentions about the biochemical, also almost terraforming of the Americas. The genocide that happened was mostly biochemical. It was it was disease. It wasn't mostly millions of people. So and architecture is part of that biochemical planetary that we're part of. It's a physical arrangement. So when you mention agriculture, remind me right now, I'm also thinking it was geoengineering happening as a historical event, right? We sort of, like corn, for instance. We know corn was manufactured by pre-Hispanic cultures. It wasn't something that just popped in a tree and that's it. We know that agriculture, in a way, is design of the earth. So yeah, exactly. Like, in a way, it's sort of I see that that's the centralized diagram when we see the interventions of Earth by our human settlements, and how architecture is part of the equation. Always is going to be part of the question of the equation. Why? Because our bodies, like also Khares was saying, we're political, we move, we need space, we sort of, because architecture is not just objects and buildings, it's the space in general. So of course that rearrangement of the earth is going to bring rearrangement of physical arrangements as well. And this but usually when we talk about architecture, we tend to separate it as objects. And yeah, you're right. I think I would love to look more into more historical events of how the terraforming of the earth is linked to architecture, and the question of the human, because what is the human in the question in our architecture practice and discipline? To be honest, I don't have the answer to that, but that is the question that we need to ask ourselves, because that's not the human as we know it today, but the human that we want to be. This is why Reza's work is amazing. The inhuman, the look within and alienate certain things and answer this. But yeah, I don't know if this is what you.
Very well put. Thank you. I wanted to ask both of you with something, which is that, do you think that there is or could be sort of synthesis of the two things you were talking about, a sort of planetary architecture, if this is how you put it, Denise, and also a sort of radical democratic space? So yeah, sorry, it's a very open and general question, but yeah, you can answer it any way you like or not.
Denise. Okay. Yes, I think that like we can we can fantasize about radical democratic communities, like the agonistic aspect of our reality is immanent in any case. But trying to imagine a world where communal ways of socializing have managed to overcome the structures of capitalist democracies and colonialism and extra statecraft. That sounds like really fab, but it's, I think that and with what Denise was saying, that by inhabiting the space and by actually having communal and political activity in the space, you reinvent it and you push its forms and the understanding of its forms, and that human activity actually identifies the space as what it is. I just think that this is a dialogue between form and function, for the way I see it, and the questions of form and function in architecture, modernity onwards, are very, very critical. In this era of network culture after the postmodernism, yeah, I think that this dialogue can create technologies that can push us forward, but other technologies seem to be much more important and have much more power over us than architecture at this time.
Well, thank you. Denise, anything you want to add to that?
Yes, and also something that Khares mentioned on his lecture about boundaries that are not spatial, boundaries that are not physical. And I think as architects, we do not work only with space. We work with ideas. We work within the abstract. We work within the political. And sometimes the information, the boundaries of the information that we are receiving and then manifesting, it may manifest in a world. That's why we're world builders. But what world is it that we're basically, what world do we want? That's the question. That's why when you ask Liam about the question of between the planetary and the architecture and the radical and the what it is, or how to have agency and how to alternate, because we all want to alternate. And I think we also need to, like Khares mentioned, encounter and delineate those boundaries that are planetary, and the boundaries of our humanism, and really studying, like you mentioned, Liam, the history of our humanism, included in our, not just assume that human is just in architecture is usually, the human is just the body parts of proportions. Like, for instance, El Modulor from Le Corbusier, it's just the measure of your hand or the measure of your head, and this is information, again, information that we use to design. But the human, as we know, is not only measurement of parts, and I think like we say in our practice, the body is planetary. And an example that I love is, how is it that when there's a full moon, a lot of pregnant women just go to labor without notice? Why? Because our bodies are connected to intraplanetary forces that we cannot see. So we need to re-understand also what the body is, what the human is, again. And in turn, in the history of architecture, it's never mentioned how our notion of the human and what it is actually radically changes our practice. But it's a question that I have, and it's a question that I'm interested in exploring, because I think it's like the chicken and the egg. I don't know which comes first, the space or the human or the imaginaries, the planetary imaginaries that we have. I think it's a more decentralized question, but yeah, I guess I answer your question with more questions.
Yeah, as you should. I think this whole notion of like I don't know how you said it, an architectural history of the human or something like this, or a humanist history of architecture. There's something to be said about that. But anyways, if you guys want, we can end the session, unless you guys want to add anything.
No, if there are no questions like on the channel, we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Khares and Denise, and thank you everybody for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.